Sometimes the broken are exactly who we need to save us. Sometimes the gentlest souls hide inside the strongest bodies. Deep in the woods beyond the fjord, a young woman named Yrsa ran for her life with bloodied feet and death following close behind. Raiders had burned her home and killed her family, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. As she collapsed in the ancient forest, certain she would die alone, a giant stepped from the shadows. Halvar Grimsson was 7 feet of scarred muscle and wild hair, a man whose name once struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. He had been the fiercest warrior in the northern lands until something broke inside him and he vanished into the wilderness. Now he carried the dying maiden in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. But could a man who had sworn never to fight again protect her from the darkness that hunted them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and in the distance, smoke still rose from what had once been the village of Bjornstead. Yrsa Eriksdottir had watched it burn from the forest's edge, her heart breaking with each flame that devoured another memory. The raiders had come at dawn when the men were out checking their nets, when the women were grinding grain, when the children were feeding the goats behind their humble homes. She pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient pine, its resin sticky against her torn dress. The bloodied linen strip she had torn from her hem was already soaked through where she had bound the sword cut on her ribs. Her bare feet, cut and bruised from her desperate flight over stone and root, throbbed with each heartbeat. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest where her family used to live. Yrsa had been the village's quiet one, the girl who helped her mother with the healing herbs, who could gentle a spooked horse with just her voice, who had never spoken a harsh word to anyone in her 22 winters. People often said she was too soft for this hard world, too gentle for the brutal realities of life on the northern coast. Her father, Eric the merchant, had worried that no man would want a wife who spent more time talking to animals than people, who preferred the company of wounded birds to the boisterous gatherings in the great hall. Now, as she listened to the distant shouts of the raiders still searching the smoking ruins, Yrsa understood that her gentleness had not been weakness. It had been preparation. Every wounded creature she had nursed back to health had taught her something about survival, about finding strength when the body wanted to give up, about the quiet, fierce will that burns in all living things when death comes calling. The memory of her last moments in the village played over and over in her mind like a terrible song. She had been in the root cellar beneath their home, gathering turnips for the morning meal, when the screaming started. By the time she climbed the wooden ladder and peered through the cellar door, flames were already licking at the thatch of her neighbor's roof. Men with painted shields and iron weapons moved through the streets like wolves through a sheep pen, their laughter mixing with the cries of her people. She had seen her father fall trying to protect old Bjorn the blacksmith. She had watched her mother disappear into a burning house, calling her name. And then rough hands had grabbed her arms, dragging her toward a ship that waited in the harbor like a hungry beast. But Yrsa had learned something from all those years of gentle patience. Sometimes the quiet ones surprise everyone, including themselves. She had bitten the raider's hand so hard she tasted blood, twisted from his grip with the desperate strength of a cornered animal, and run faster than she had ever run in her life. Behind her, angry voices shouted orders to follow, to catch the girl. But Yrsa knew these woods better than any outsider ever could. She had spent countless hours here gathering mushrooms and medicinal plants with her mother, learning the secret paths that only the deer and the village children knew. But knowledge of the forest was one thing, surviving in it with a serious wound and no supplies was another entirely. As the sun climbed higher and her strength began to fail, Yrsa started to wonder if she had simply chosen a slower death instead of a quick one. The raiders would give up their search eventually, but the woods held their own dangers. Wolves, bears, bitter cold nights, and the simple fact that a person could not live long without food or clean water. She had been stumbling through a grove of birch trees, their white bark seeming to glow in the filtered sunlight, when her legs finally betrayed her. One moment she was pushing forward with pure, stubborn will. The next, she was on her knees in the soft earth, watching her blood drip onto the fallen leaves. The world had started to spin, and she knew with the clarity that sometimes comes just before the end that she was going to die in this place. That was when the shadow fell across her. At first, she thought it might be a tree, or perhaps a standing stone left by the old gods. But trees did not move with such careful purpose, and stones did not have eyes that held the depth of winter storms. The man who emerged from between the birches was larger than any person she had ever seen, broader than 3 normal men standing together, with shoulders that could have supported the roof beam of a great hall. His hair hung past his shoulders in thick braids, bound with leather and small carved bones, dark as a moonless night, but streaked with silver that spoke of hard years and harder choices. Scars crisscrossed his exposed arms like a map of old battles, and his hands, gentle as they lifted her from the forest floor, were large enough to span her entire waist. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. They held no cruelty, no hunger for violence, just a deep sadness that seemed older than the mountains themselves. "Easy, little one," he rumbled in a voice like distant thunder, and despite his fearsome appearance, something in his tone made her feel safer than she had since the raiders first appeared on the horizon. "I have you now." Yrsa tried to speak, to thank him, or ask his name, or explain what had happened to her village, but the words would not come. They never did when she was frightened or overwhelmed, as if her voice simply retreated deep inside her chest and refused to emerge. But the giant seemed to understand her silence, nodding as if he had expected it. "No need for words," he said, cradling her against his broad chest with infinite care. "I know what happened at Bjornstead. The smoke has been visible for miles." As he carried her through the forest, with steps so sure and quiet they barely disturbed the carpet of leaves beneath their feet, Yrsa found herself studying his face. There was something familiar about the strong line of his jaw, the way he carried himself despite the gentleness of his touch. And then, as he paused to check that her makeshift bandage was still secure, she realized where she had seen those features before. In the great hall of her childhood village, hanging on the wall beside the high seat, there had been a carved wooden plaque commemorating the great warriors of the north. Heroes whose deeds were sung around winter fires, whose names mothers whispered to make their children brave. At the top of that plaque, rendered in careful detail by the village's most skilled woodcarver, was the likeness of a man who had once been the most feared berserker in all the northern lands. Halvar Grimsson, called the Stormbringer, the Wolf of Ironwood, the man who had never lost a battle and never shown mercy to his enemies. The warrior who had vanished from the world 10 winters ago after the Battle of Red Stones, leaving behind only legends and the kind of stories that grew taller with each telling. But the man carrying her now, though he shared that carved face, seemed like a different person entirely. Where the legends spoke of wild fury and bloodthirsty rage, this Halvar moved with deliberate calm. Where the stories told of a warrior who laughed as he killed, this man's eyes held only compassion and old pain. "You know who I am," he said without looking down at her, and it was not a question. "I can see it in your face." Yrsa tried again to find her voice, to tell him that knowing his name did not frighten her, that somehow his presence made her feel more protected than any army could. But the words remained locked away, and she could only nod against his chest. "The stories they tell are not lies," Halvar continued as they walked deeper into the woods, following a path that only he seemed able to see. "I was everything they say I was, and worse things besides. But that was a long time ago, in a different life. The man who carried that name is as dead as your village, little one. What remains is just someone who tends a garden and tries to remember what it feels like to be human." They travelled in comfortable silence after that, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear more soothing than any lullaby. Yrsa found herself drifting in and out of a light sleep, exhaustion finally claiming her now that she was safe. But even as she dozed, part of her mind remained alert, cataloguing details about her rescuer and trying to understand how the most violent man in the north had become someone capable of such tenderness. His hands, despite their size and the calluses that spoke of years wielding sword and axe, were gentle as a healer's when he adjusted her position to keep pressure off her wound. His voice, when he occasionally murmured reassurances or warnings about low branches, held none of the harsh command she would have expected from a legendary war leader, and his pace, though steady and tireless, never jarred her injury or made her uncomfortable. Most telling of all was the way forest creatures reacted to his presence. Birds did not flee when he approached, but merely watched with curious eyes. A red deer that crossed their path paused to study him for a long moment before moving on without fear. Even a family of rabbits barely bothered to hop aside as he passed, as if they somehow recognized that this giant posed no threat to anything that meant no harm. "How?" Yrsa whispered, the single word barely audible even to herself, but Halvar heard it and understood. 10 winters ago, I killed a boy," he said simply, his voice carrying no emotion except tired honesty. "Not in battle, not in the heat of bloodlust, just because he was standing where I wanted to walk. He could not have been more than 15 summers, probably somebody's beloved son, and I cut him down like he was nothing more than an obstacle." They had reached a small clearing where wildflowers grew in patches of sunlight, and Halvar paused beside a fallen log that was covered in soft moss. With infinite care, he settled Yrsa against its cushioned surface, checking once more that her wound was not bleeding through the bandage. "Something broke in me when I saw what I had done," he continued, kneeling beside her and pulling a leather waterskin from his pack. "All those years of killing, of taking pride in my skill with blade and fury, and it took the death of one frightened boy to show me what I had become. I walked away from everything that day, my warband, my reputation, my name, swore on my father's grave that I would never again raise a weapon in anger." The water was clean and cold, and as she drank, Yrsa studied the face of this gentle giant who had once been the most feared warrior in the world. There was peace in his expression now, a hard-won serenity that came from years of deliberate choice. But underneath that calm surface, she could see the strength that legends were made of, carefully contained but ready to emerge if needed. "You have not spoken since I found you," Halvar observed, settling cross-legged beside her with the easy grace of a much smaller man. "Was it the shock of the raid, or is silence simply your nature?" Yrsa opened her mouth to explain about her voice, about how it had always retreated when she most needed it, about the way words seemed to tangle in her throat whenever she was overwhelmed by strong emotion. But as she tried to form the first sentence, she realized something had changed. The terrible knot in her chest that usually strangled her speech was still there, but smaller somehow, as if this man's presence had loosened something that had been tight for far too long. "Both," she managed, the word clear and steady in the afternoon air. "I have always been this way when I am frightened or sad. But today, with my family gone, with everything burned, it feels like there are no words big enough." Halvar nodded as if he understood completely. "Grief has its own language," he said. "Sometimes the heart speaks better in silence." They had been walking for 3 days through terrain that grew wilder and more remote with each step. Halvar knew paths through the mountains that seemed to exist only when he needed them, routes that followed ridge lines and game trails far from any human settlement. He carried Yrsa when her strength failed, which happened often despite her determined efforts to walk on her own, and tended her wound with a knowledge of healing that surprised her. "My mother was a wise woman," he explained as he changed her bandage beside a clear mountain stream. "Before I chose the path of war, she taught me the old ways, herbs for pain, how to clean a wound properly, which plants stop bleeding and which ones fight infection." His hands were steady and sure as he worked, and Yrsa found herself studying the care he took with each movement. This was not the rough field medicine of a soldier, but the gentle touch of someone who understood that healing required patience. The carved bone needle he used to stitch the deepest part of her cut was worn smooth with age, and she realized it must have belonged to his mother, carried all these years as a reminder of the man he had once been before war changed him. "The raiders," Yrsa said, her voice growing stronger each day in his presence. "Do you think they are still looking for survivors?" Halvar finished securing the clean bandage and helped her back into her torn dress, his touch carefully respectful. "No. Men like that take what they can carry and move on quickly. They know the village men who were out on their boats will return soon, and they have no interest in fighting a prepared enemy." As they climbed higher into the mountains, following a path that wound between massive stone pillars left by ancient glaciers, Halvar told her about his home. He had built a cabin in a hidden valley where no one would ever think to look, a place where he could live simply and harm no one. There was a garden for vegetables, a small herd of goats, and enough solitude to forget that the outside world existed. "It sounds peaceful," Yrsa said, and meant it. After watching her entire life burn in a single morning, the idea of a quiet place hidden from violence held enormous appeal. "It has been," Halvar agreed, but something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "Though I suspect those days are ending." They crested a ridge just as the sun reached its highest point, and Halvar stopped so suddenly that Yrsa nearly walked into his broad back. Below them, nestled in a valley that should have been empty except for trees and wild grass, spread a sight that made her blood turn to ice. A war camp. Not the rough collection of tents and cooking fires that raiders might throw together for a single night, but a serious military installation with earthwork fortifications, supply wagons, and the disciplined organization of a professional army. Hundreds of warriors moved through the camp with purposeful efficiency, and even at this distance, Yrsa could see the glint of quality weapons and armor. "This is not possible," Halvar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No one knows about this valley. No one could have found it." He stopped speaking as the sound of hoofbeats reached them from the path below. Someone was climbing toward their position, moving fast and with clear intent. Without a word, Halvar lifted Yrsa in his arms and slipped behind a massive boulder that jutted from the ridge like the backbone of some buried giant. The rider, who appeared moments later, was not what either of them expected. Instead of a warrior in mail and leather, a young woman emerged into view, her horse lathered with sweat and her face tight with urgency. She wore the simple brown robes of a monastery scribe, and her mount was a gentle mare, better suited to carrying messages than engaging in warfare. But it was the carved wooden box strapped to her saddle that made Halvar's breath catch in recognition. The container was ancient, its surface covered with runes that seemed to shift and writhe when looked at directly. He knew those symbols, had seen them once before in the hall of a king whose name was no longer spoken aloud. "The Chronicle of Endings," he breathed, the words barely audible even to himself. The young woman, for she could not have been much older than Yrsa, guided her horse to the edge of the ridge and dismounted. With careful reverence, she opened the wooden box and withdrew a massive tome, bound in what looked like scales rather than leather. As she opened the book and began to read from its pages, her voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "In the 23rd year of King Harald's reign, when the ice broke early and the ravens flew backward, the great army of Ragnar Ironbone did march against the hidden sanctuary of Halvar Stormbringer, called by some the Wolf of Ironwood, seeking the ancient treasure known as the Heart of Winter." Yrsa felt Halvar's body go rigid beside her, every muscle tensing as if preparing for battle. His breathing became shallow and controlled, and when she looked at his face, she saw the expression of a man watching his worst nightmare take shape before his eyes. "The Chronicle speaks of you," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "That book It knows you are here. Not just that I am here, Halvar replied grimly. It knows what I guard. The young scribe continued reading, her voice gaining strength as if drawing power from the words themselves. The heart of winter sleeps in the valley where no ravens fly, protected by one who has forsworn his nature but cannot escape his destiny. When the wolf's blood runs again, the ice shall wake, and the ending of all things shall begin. As the words echoed off the mountain walls, the temperature around them began to drop. Not gradually, as it might when a cloud passed over the sun, but instantly and dramatically. As if winter itself was listening to the ancient prophecy, frost began to form on the rocks around them despite the bright afternoon sunlight, and their breath became visible in white puffs. "We have to leave," Halvar said, already moving to gather their supplies. Now, the sound of war horns from the valley below cut off his words. Deep, resonant blasts that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. As they watched in horror, the organized chaos of the war camp shifted into something far more dangerous, a military force preparing to march. "They know you heard," Yrsa said, stating the obvious, because sometimes terror made a person speak just to prove they were still alive. "That scribe, that book, it was a trap." Halvar nodded grimly as he lifted her once again, his movements now urgent rather than gentle. The Chronicle of Endings is not just a book of prophecies. It is a tool of fate itself, used to ensure that certain events come to pass, whether the participants want them to or not. By reading those words aloud in this place, that girl has set forces in motion that cannot be stopped. They ran then, or rather Halvar ran while carrying Yrsa, his long legs covering ground with the kind of desperate speed that only came when death was close behind. But even as they fled, Yrsa could hear the sound of pursuit growing closer, not just the thunder of hooves and the shouts of warriors, but something else, something that made the air itself seem to vibrate with malevolent purpose. "The heart of winter," she gasped out between jarring steps. "What is it? What do they want?" "Something that should never be disturbed," Halvar replied without slowing his pace. "Something I swore to guard, not because I wanted power, but because I was the only one strong enough to resist its call. And now, because of what that scribe has done, I may have no choice but to become the very monster I spent 10 years learning not to be." Behind them, the war horns sounded again, closer now, and accompanied by the howling of wolves that should not have existed in these mountains. The Chronicle of Endings had spoken, fate had been set in motion, and the most dangerous man in the northern lands was being forced to remember why legends about him still frightened children in their beds. "But if you fight," Yrsa said, understanding the terrible choice that lay before him, "if you break your oath, then the man who saved you will die," Halvar finished grimly, "and Halvar Stormbringer will wake from his 10-year sleep. The question is whether that will be enough to protect what must be protected, or whether this is simply the beginning of something much worse." Halvar's hidden valley lay beyond a narrow canyon that could only be entered through a gap between two massive boulders, a natural gate that he had discovered years ago during his desperate flight from his old life. As they squeezed through the opening, Yrsa could see why no army would ever think to look here. The entrance was so perfectly concealed that even standing directly in front of it, the passage looked like nothing more than a shadow between stones. The valley beyond took her breath away. Protected by sheer cliff walls on all sides, it was a perfect circle of green meadow dotted with wildflowers and crossed by a crystal stream that emerged from a spring at the far end. Ancient pine trees grew along the edges like natural sentinels, their branches so thick they formed a living roof that kept the space hidden from above. At the valley's heart stood a log cabin that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, its walls weathered silver by mountain storms and its roof thick with moss. "It's beautiful," Yrsa whispered, momentarily forgetting the danger that pursued them. This was not the rough shelter of a hermit, but a true home, built by someone who understood that exile did not mean abandoning all comfort or beauty. 10 years I have been building this place, Halvar said, setting her down gently beside the cabin's wooden steps. Every log, cut and shaped by hand, every stone in the foundation, placed with care. I hoped it would be enough to make me forget what I once was. But even as he spoke, his attention was focused on the valley's entrance. The narrow passage that had kept him safe for a decade now felt like a trap. The single way in and out, suddenly seeming less like protection and more like a corridor for his enemies. The war horns had gone silent, which worried him more than if they had continued sounding. Silence meant the army was moving with purpose now, no longer announcing their presence, but hunting with deadly intent. "There is something you must see," he said, leading her around the side of the cabin to where a small wooden shed stood, half hidden beneath the spreading branches of an enormous spruce. Something I hoped never to disturb again. The shed's door was bound with iron and sealed with a lock that looked far too complex for such a humble structure. But it was the symbol carved deep into the wood above the entrance that made Yrsa step back in sudden recognition. A howling wolf's head, surrounded by intricate knotwork, the same design that had decorated the banner of Halvar Stormbringer in the old songs. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and hung carefully on wooden pegs, was the complete war gear of a legendary berserker. The mail shirt was made from rings so fine they looked like scales, each one inscribed with runes of protection and fury. The helmet bore the carved antlers of a great stag, and its face guard was wrought in the likeness of a snarling beast. 2 massive axes hung crossed on the back wall, their blades polished to mirror brightness despite years of storage, and their handles worn smooth by the grip of hands that had never known defeat. "I kept them," Halvar said quietly, telling myself it was just practical caution, that a wise man should never discard useful tools completely. But the truth is harder than that. Part of me was afraid that someday I might need to remember how to be the monster again. Yrsa reached out to touch the mail shirt and immediately pulled her hand back. Even through the protective leather, she could feel something radiating from the metal, not heat or cold, but a kind of sleeping violence that made her skin crawl. These were not just weapons and armor, but artifacts of war itself, imbued with years of bloodshed and battle fury. "The heart of winter," she said, understanding beginning to dawn. "In this valley." Halvar nodded toward the far end of the meadow, where the natural spring bubbled up from beneath a pile of moss-covered stones. Beneath the water source, sealed away where its influence cannot spread, guarded by someone who swore to resist its call no matter what the cost. What is it exactly? The last fragment of the winter that never ended, the ice that covered the world before the first men learned to make fire. Some say it fell from the sky like a star. Others believe it was forged by gods who wanted to see what would happen if cold itself could think and want and hate. Halvar moved to examine his axes, checking the balance and edge as if his hands remembered their weight despite years of disuse. "What I know for certain is that it whispers to men's hearts, promising power to those who would claim it, offering the strength to freeze their enemies' blood in their veins and cover the earth with endless winter. And you've been guarding it alone all this time. Someone had to. After the Battle of Red Stones, when I saw what happened to the last man who tried to claim it, I realized that the only way to keep such a thing safe was to have it watched by someone who wanted nothing it could offer." He lifted one of the axes, testing its familiar weight. A man who had seen enough of war and death to know that some prices are too high to pay, no matter what the reward. Through the valley's natural acoustics, they could hear the distant sound of many feet moving through the canyon, carefully but with steady purpose. The army had found the entrance and was making its way toward them. Soon, very soon, the peaceful sanctuary that had sheltered Halvar's transformation from killer to healer would become a battlefield. "I could run," he said, speaking more to himself than to her. "Take you and flee deeper into the mountains, leave the heart for them to claim. It would preserve my oath, keep my hands clean of violence. But you won't. No, because I know what Ragnar Ironbone would do with such power, the man who burned your village for sport, who kills for the simple pleasure of watching things die. Imagine him with the ability to bring endless winter to the world. Halvar set the axe aside and turned to face her directly. I cannot allow that, even if stopping it means becoming the very thing I swore never to be again. Yrsa looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw the weight of an impossible choice. This gentle giant who had carried her to safety, who tended her wounds with a healer's touch, who spoke to forest animals as if they were old friends. He was preparing to sacrifice everything he had built in order to protect people who would never know what he had done for them. "There has to be another way," she said, though even as the words left her mouth she could hear how desperate they sounded. "Some path that doesn't require you to break your oath." "Perhaps," Halvar agreed, but his tone suggested he had little hope. "Though I fear the only question now is whether 10 years of peace have made me too weak to do what must be done, or if the monster that lives in every warrior's heart can be controlled long enough to save what needs saving." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Soon there would be no more time for choices, no more room for anything but action. The first warrior to emerge from the canyon passage was not what Yrsa had expected. Instead of some battle-scarred veteran with cruel eyes and blood-stained weapons, a young man stepped into the valley with the uncertain gait of someone who had never been in a real fight. He wore mail that was too big for his frame and carried a sword that seemed heavy in his inexperienced grip. "This is wrong," the youth called back toward the passage, his voice cracking with nervousness. "Brother Finn said we would find a monster's lair, but this is it's beautiful, like something from the old, peaceful stories." Behind him came others, and Yrsa felt her heart sink as she realized the truth. This was not an army of seasoned killers, but something far worse, young men barely out of boyhood, their faces bright with the kind of eager anticipation that only came from those who had never seen real violence. Farm boys and merchant sons playing at being warriors, led by someone who had filled their heads with tales of glory and heroic deeds. "They're just children," she whispered to Halvar, who stood frozen in the doorway of his weapon shed, like a man watching his worst nightmare take shape. "Children can kill just as dead as veterans," he replied grimly, but she could hear the pain in his voice. "Sometimes more so, because they don't understand what they're doing until it's too late." The young warriors spread out across the meadow with the kind of clumsy formation that spoke of recent training and little experience. They pointed at the cabin and whispered among themselves, clearly expecting to find some dark fortress rather than a simple home surrounded by vegetable gardens and goat pens. Their confusion was evident. This place of peace and growing things did not match the stories they had been told about the lair of Halvar Stormbringer. "Where is the monster?" one of them called out, his voice carrying the false bravado of youth, trying to convince itself it was not afraid. "Where is the terrible berserker who bathes in blood and decorates his hall with the skulls of his enemies?" From the canyon passage came the sound of heavier footsteps, and Yrsa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The real danger was not these confused boys, but whatever had filled their minds with tales of glory and sent them here to die for something they did not understand. The man who emerged next was everything the young warriors were not, tall but lean rather than massive, with the kind of predatory grace that spoke of someone who had survived by being faster and more cunning than his opponents. His hair was dark silver, pulled back in a tight warrior's knot, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of a serpent studying its prey. He wore no mail, just leather and wool, but the sword at his side was clearly no ornament. "Ragnar Ironbone," Halvar said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "I should have known." "Hello, old friend," Ragnar called across the meadow, his voice carrying easily in the still air. 10 years you've hidden from me. 10 years you've played at being a simple farmer while guarding something that rightfully belongs to those strong enough to claim it." He moved among the young warriors like a wolf among sheep, placing encouraging hands on shoulders and speaking words of false confidence. But Yrsa could see the calculation in his movements, the way he positioned the boys between himself and any potential threat, using their eager bodies as shields while he assessed the situation. "These are not your warriors," Halvar observed, stepping out from the shed with empty hands but dangerous purpose in his posture. "They're sacrifices. Lambs you've led to slaughter. They're volunteers," Ragnar corrected with a smile that held no warmth. "Young men hungry for glory and gold, eager to follow the legendary Ironbone into battle against the famous Stormbringer. I may have neglected to mention certain details about our history, but their enthusiasm is genuine." One of the young warriors, braver or more foolish than the rest, stepped forward with his sword raised in what he probably imagined was a heroic pose. "Surrender, berserker. Your reign of terror is ended. We've come to claim the treasure you guard for the glory of—" The boy's words ended in a gurgle as Ragnar's blade found his throat from behind. The iron slid between neck and spine, with the kind of practiced precision that spoke of countless similar murders, and the youth crumpled to the meadow grass without ever understanding what had happened to him. "Lesson 1, Ragnar said conversationally to the remaining warriors, who stared in shock at their dead companion. "Never turn your back on your commander. Lesson 2, you're not here to capture anything. You're here to die slowly enough to force the Stormbringer to break his precious oath." The truth hit the surviving boys like a physical blow. Some reached for their weapons with shaking hands. Others simply stood paralyzed by the realization that they had been betrayed. But all of them now understood that they were not heroes on a glorious quest, but bait in a trap designed by a master manipulator. "You bastard," one of them managed, his young voice thick with rage and terror. "We trusted you. We believed." "You believed what I needed you to believe," Ragnar interrupted, already moving toward his next victim. "And now, you'll serve the purpose I brought you here to serve. Your deaths will force the famous Halvar Grimsson to remember what he really is, to pick up those legendary axes and become the monster again. Because even a saint cannot watch innocents die without acting." Yrsa felt something cold settle in her stomach as she understood the full cruelty of Ragnar's plan. He had not brought an army to fight Halvar. He had brought a collection of sacrificial victims whose murders would force the gentle giant to break his most sacred vow. Each death would be a weight on Halvar's conscience, each scream a chisel hammering away at his carefully constructed peace. "And once he takes up weapons again," Ragnar continued, circling his terrified followers like a predator selecting his next meal, "once the berserker's fury fills his heart again, he'll be too lost in bloodlust to think clearly about protecting that ancient ice. The heart of winter will be mine, and with it I'll have power enough to freeze the seas themselves." The iron pendant that hung around Ragnar's neck caught the afternoon light as he moved, and Yrsa saw with horror that it was carved in the shape of a winter storm, the same symbol that decorated the locked box in which the heart of winter rested. This man had not come seeking randomly for power. He knew exactly what lay beneath the valley's spring, and he had planned this corruption of Halvar's nature with the precision of a master craftsman. The second murder came with surgical precision. Ragnar moved like a dance partner, stepping through familiar choreography, his blade finding the gap beneath a young warrior's raised arm and sliding between ribs to pierce the heart. The boy died with surprise still written across his features, never having had time to process what was happening to him. "Stop!" The cry tore from Yrsa's throat before she could think, her voice carrying across the meadow with surprising strength. "These children have done nothing to deserve this." Ragnar paused in his methodical slaughter and turned toward the cabin with interest, as if noticing her for the first time. "Ah, the Stormbringer has acquired a companion. How very domestic of you, Halvar. Though I wonder if she understands what manner of beast she's chosen to shelter with." The remaining young warriors there, were perhaps a dozen left alive, had finally begun to grasp their situation. Some backed toward the valley walls with weapons raised, others clustered together in the center of the meadow like sheep sensing wolves in the darkness. Their faces showed the terrible moment of transition from boyhood confidence to the adult understanding that death was real and coming for them. "Please," one of them called toward Halvar, his voice breaking with desperation. "Please help us. We didn't know, we thought we were doing something honorable." Halvar stood motionless beside his weapon shed, his massive hands clenched into fists, but his feet planted firmly in place. Yrsa could see the war being fought behind his storm-grey eyes. 10 years of carefully built peace, warring against the ancient instinct to protect the innocent. Every muscle in his body strained toward action, but his oath held him frozen like a man caught between two avalanches. "You see the beauty of this trap," Ragnar said conversationally, selecting his next victim with the casual air of a farmer choosing which chicken to slaughter for dinner. "I know you, old friend, better than you know yourself, perhaps. You can watch enemies die without flinching, can stand unmoved while warriors face the consequences of their choices. But children? Innocents who were lied to and betrayed? That cuts deeper than any blade." The third death was slower. Ragnar's sword took the young man in the belly, a wound designed to kill gradually while producing maximum agony. The boy fell to his knees in the trampled meadow grass, clutching at his torn abdomen while his life leaked out between his fingers. "Help me," he gasped, looking directly at Halvar with eyes that held no understanding of why this was happening to him. "Please, I don't want to die like this." Yrsa felt something break inside her chest as she watched Halvar's face contort with anguish. This gentle giant who had carried her to safety, who tended wounded animals and grew vegetables with his own hands, was being forced to watch innocents suffer while his sacred oath prevented him from acting. "There is another choice," she said suddenly, the words coming from some deep place she had not known existed within her. "Let me go to them." "Absolutely not," Halvar said without taking his eyes off the dying boy. "You're wounded, untrained, defenseless. You would simply be giving Ragnar another victim to use against me." But Yrsa was already moving, stepping out from behind the cabin despite Halvar's sharp command to stop. She had spent her entire life being the quiet one, the gentle soul who spoke to animals better than people, who preferred the safety of silence to the risk of conflict. But watching these children die, while the one man who could save them stood paralyzed by principle, was more than her heart could bear. "I am Yrsa Eriksdottir," she called across the meadow, her voice carrying with a clarity that surprised even her. "Daughter of Eric the merchant, survivor of the burning of Bjornstead. You want to force Halvar to break his oath by murdering innocents? Then you'll have to go through me first." Ragnar laughed, the sound like winter wind through bare branches. "A brave gesture, little mouse, but what exactly do you think you can accomplish? You have no weapon, no training, no hope of victory. You're simply adding yourself to the list of deaths that will weigh on the Stormbringer's conscience." "Perhaps," Yrsa agreed, continuing to walk steadily across the meadow toward the clustered young warriors. "But I can do something you cannot. I can give them a choice that matters." She reached the group of surviving boys and knelt beside the one who was dying from his belly wound. His face was pale with shock and pain, but his eyes focused on her with desperate hope. Without hesitation, she tore another strip from her already ruined dress and began trying to bind his wound. "Listen to me," she said, her voice pitched to carry to all the survivors. "All of you. This man," she nodded toward Ragnar, "has betrayed you completely. He cares nothing for your lives or your families or your dreams. You are tools to him, nothing more." "We know that now," one of the older boys said bitterly. "But knowing doesn't change anything. We're still trapped here with a madman who wants to kill us slowly." "You're not trapped," Yrsa said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "You can choose how this ends. You can die as victims, weeping and begging while he cuts you down one by one, or you can die as warriors, standing together and fighting for something that matters." From across the meadow, Ragnar called out with amusement. "And what exactly would they be fighting for, little mouse? Their own lives are already forfeit." Yrsa stood slowly, helping the wounded boy lean against one of his companions. They would be fighting to protect the one good thing in this valley. To keep a man who has spent 10 years learning to be gentle from being forced back into darkness. To ensure that the heart of winter never falls into the hands of someone who would use it to bring suffering to the world. The surviving warriors looked at each other with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. They were still outnumbered, still facing certain death, but now they had been offered something precious, the chance to make their deaths mean something beyond Ragnar's cruel manipulation. "If we fight," the oldest of them said slowly, "if we stand with you against him, what happens to the big man's oath?" "I don't know," Yrsa admitted, "but I know that some things are worth more than perfect principles. Sometimes the only way to preserve what makes us human is to risk losing it." Behind her, she could hear Halvar making a sound like a man whose heart was being torn in half. The trap that Ragnar had laid was working perfectly, but perhaps not in the way he had expected. The wooden training sword had been carved from a single piece of mountain ash, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of practice. Halvar had made it during his first winter in the valley, thinking he might use it to stay in fighting shape without breaking his oath against carrying true weapons. Instead, it had become a symbol of his commitment to leaving violence behind, a warrior's tool transformed into something harmless. Now, as Yrsa picked it up from where it leaned against his cabin's wall, the practice sword felt surprisingly heavy in her hands. She had never held any weapon before, had spent her life healing rather than harming, but desperation could teach even the gentlest soul to reach for whatever protection was available. "You cannot be serious," Ragnar called across the meadow, his tone shifting from amusement to genuine bewilderment. "A village healer with a wooden sword? This is your great plan to save these children?" The surviving young warriors had arranged themselves in a rough circle around their wounded companion, their real swords held with the awkward grip of those who had trained more with straw targets than living opponents. They looked to Yrsa with a mixture of hope and doubt, clearly wanting to believe that her courage could somehow even the odds against a master killer. "I'm not trying to save them," Yrsa said, adjusting her grip on the practice weapon and finding a stance that felt natural despite her complete lack of training. "I'm trying to give them the chance to save themselves." What followed was unlike any battle that had ever been fought in the northern lands. Ragnar advanced with the fluid grace of a professional killer, his steel blade cutting through the air with lethal precision. But instead of meeting him with desperate fury or panicked retreat, Yrsa simply stood her ground and waited. When his first strike came, a diagonal cut designed to split her from shoulder to hip, she stepped aside with the kind of intuitive movement that comes not from training, but from a lifetime of avoiding startled horses and aggressive goats. The steel blade whistled past her ear, missing by barely a finger's width. "Interesting," Ragnar murmured, recovering from his swing and circling her like a wolf testing its prey. "You move like someone who understands how violence flows, even if you've never practiced it yourself." The young warriors attacked in a ragged charge, while Ragnar was focused on Yrsa, their swords flashing in the afternoon sunlight. But inexperience told quickly within moments. 2 more of them lay bleeding in the meadow grass, and the others had been driven back by Ragnar's superior skill and reach. "Did you see how easily they fell?" He called to Halvar, who still stood frozen by his weapons shed. "Did you see how their blood stains your precious peaceful valley? Each death is on your hands, old friend. Each life could have been saved if you simply picked up your axes and remembered what you really are." But something unexpected was happening. As Ragnar continued his methodical slaughter of the young men, Yrsa began to move with increasing confidence. Her wooden sword couldn't cut or pierce, but it could block and parry, and she discovered an instinct for reading an opponent's intentions that surprised even her. "You're learning." one of the wounded boys gasped out as she deflected another of Ragnar's attacks. Somehow you're getting better at this. She was. With each exchange, each desperate attempt to keep Ragnar's steel away from innocent flesh, Yrsa found herself understanding something fundamental about the rhythm of combat. Not the technical aspects that took years to master, but the deeper flow of intention and response that connected all living things when they fought for survival. My mother used to say that healing and harming were two sides of the same skill, she explained between clashes, her breath coming in short gasps from the effort of staying ahead of Ragnar's blade. To mend a bone, you must understand how bones break. To heal a wound, you must know how wounds are made. Ragnar's eyes narrowed as he began to realize that his seemingly helpless opponent was not falling as quickly as he had expected. Clever words, little mouse. But cleverness won't save you when steel meets flesh. He changed his tactics then, abandoning the clean killing strokes that had served him against the young warriors, and instead adopting the brutal, efficient techniques used against armored opponents. His blade came in low and fast, seeking the soft places where wood could not effectively block steel. The cut that opened Yrsa's left arm was shallow but long, a line of fire that ran from elbow to wrist. The second strike caught her across the ribs, parting cloth and skin with surgical precision. But instead of falling or crying out, she adjusted her stance and kept fighting, her wooden sword moving with increasing sureness. "Why aren't you afraid?" Ragnar demanded, genuine confusion creeping into his voice. "You're dying by degrees, girl. Why do you keep fighting when you know you cannot win?" "Because winning isn't the point," Yrsa replied, deflecting another strike and managing to land a solid blow of her own across Ragnar's shoulder. The wooden blade couldn't cut through leather and mail, but it carried enough force to bruise and jar. The point is choosing how to lose. Behind Ragnar's advancing form, she could see Halvar's face contorting with an agony that went deeper than physical pain. Each drop of her blood that fell to the meadow grass was another weight on his conscience, another crack in the careful structure of peace he had built over 10 years of exile. "She's going to die," one of the surviving young warriors said, his voice thick with grief and rage. "That monster is going to kill her, and we're too weak to stop him." But the oldest of the boys, the one who had first asked about Halvar's oath, stepped forward with his sword raised despite the wounds that decorated his arms and chest. "Then we die with her, all of us, standing together. If our deaths can preserve one good man's peace, if they can keep this heart of winter from falling into evil hands, then they matter." The wooden practice sword was beginning to splinter under the repeated impact of Ragnar's steel, and Yrsa could feel her strength ebbing with each passing moment. But she had accomplished something important. She had given meaning to what was happening, had transformed a cruel manipulation into something that resembled heroism. "Now, Stormbringer," Ragnar called across the bloody meadow. "Now, while she still lives, take up your weapons and become the monster again, or watch her die, knowing you could have saved her." The scream that tore from Halvar's throat was not human. It was the sound of something primal breaking free, the roar of a caged beast finally given license to hunt. But as he took his first step toward the weapon shed, something impossible happened. The wooden training sword in Yrsa's hands began to change. It started as a faint glow, barely visible in the afternoon sunlight, but quickly intensified until the mountain ash seemed to burn with cold fire. The splintered edges where Ragnar's steel had bitten deep began to heal themselves, the wood flowing like water to restore the weapon's original form. And as the transformation continued, the simple practice sword became something else entirely. "That's not possible," Ragnar breathed, his own advance faltering as he stared at the weapon in Yrsa's grip. "Wood cannot become steel. Mortal craft cannot—" His words cut off as the truth hit him like a physical blow. The sword Yrsa now held was not made of mountain ash transformed into metal, but of ice so pure and cold that it looked like polished steel. The blade edge gleamed with a sharpness that seemed to cut the very air around it, and frost began to form on the grass wherever drops of melted ice fell from its surface. "The heart of winter," Halvar said, his voice filled with wonder and horror in equal measure. "It's not hidden beneath the spring, it never was." From the far end of the valley, where the natural spring bubbled up from beneath its covering of moss-covered stones, came a sound like the earth itself sighing. The water that had flowed clear and warm for countless years suddenly ran dark, and the temperature around the spring dropped so rapidly that ice began to form on the surface despite the summer heat. "You clever, clever man," Ragnar said, understanding flooding his features as the pieces of a decade-old deception fell into place. "You never hid it away at all. You absorbed it into yourself, made yourself the guardian not by watching over it, but by carrying it within your very soul." The young warriors who still lived stared in amazement as Yrsa raised the ice blade, testing its balance with movements that seemed to come from muscle memory she had never possessed. The weapon felt perfectly suited to her grip, as if it had been waiting 10 years for her specifically to claim it. "But how?" she asked, looking from the impossible sword to Halvar's stricken face. "How can I wield something that you've been guarding? How can it respond to me when I have no connection to—" "Because you do have a connection," Halvar interrupted, his voice hollow with the weight of truths he had hoped never to reveal. "Because the heart of winter doesn't just respond to warriors or conquerors, it calls to those who understand sacrifice, who would give everything to protect others. And you, Yrsa Eriksdottir, have just proven yourself to be exactly that kind of person." The ice sword pulsed in her hands like a living thing, and with each pulse she could feel knowledge flowing into her mind. Not memories exactly, but understanding of stance and strike, of the precise angle needed to part mail rings, of how to read an opponent's intentions in the set of their shoulders and the positioning of their feet. "The Chronicle of Endings," she said suddenly, pieces of the puzzle clicking together with crystalline clarity. "It wasn't prophecy at all, was it? It was instruction. A spell designed to awaken the heart of winter's true nature by creating the exact circumstances needed for it to choose a new guardian." Ragnar's face went pale as he realized the magnitude of his error. "I was played. That scribe, that book, they weren't tools I was using to force Halvar into breaking his oath. They were tools being used to manipulate me into bringing the right person to this valley at exactly the right moment." "But who would have that kind of foresight?" one of the surviving young warriors asked, his voice weak from blood loss but sharp with curiosity. "Who could orchestrate something so complex across so many years?" The answer came not in words, but in the sudden appearance of a figure at the valley's entrance. The young scribe who had read from the Chronicle of Endings stepped through the narrow passage, but her brown monastery robes were gone, replaced by the silver-trimmed blue of a winter priestess. Her mousy brown hair had become white as fresh snow, and her eyes held the ageless depth of someone who had seen centuries pass like seasons. "My apologies for the deception," she said, her voice carrying easily across the bloodied meadow. "But some manipulations require that all participants believe they are acting from their own free will." "A vulva," Halvar breathed, using the old word for the wise women who could see the threads that connected past and future. "You're one of the old seers." "The last one, perhaps," she agreed with a sad smile. "And when I saw what was coming, the long winter that would follow if the heart fell into the wrong hands, I knew that extraordinary measures would be required to prevent it." She walked calmly across the meadow, stepping over the bodies of the fallen young warriors with the detached air of someone who had seen too much death to be moved by it anymore. As she passed each corpse, she paused to whisper words in the old tongue, and their wounds began to close, their chests to rise and fall with renewed breath. "You can bring them back?" Yrsa asked, hope flaring in her chest like a rekindled fire. "Death is rarely as final as people believe," the vulva replied, "especially when it serves no purpose beyond manipulation. These boys were never meant to die here. They were meant to witness something, to carry word back to the world about what they had seen. But even as the murdered warriors stirred back to life, Ragnar was backing toward the valley's entrance with the desperate haste of a man who finally understood how completely he had been outmaneuvered. His grand plan to claim the heart of winter had collapsed into ruin, but he was still alive, still dangerous, and still capable of causing untold harm if allowed to escape. "You think this ends here?" he called out as he reached the passage between the boulders. "You think stopping me prevents anything? There are others who know what lies in this valley now, others who will come seeking the power you guard. This is just the beginning." The ice sword in Yrsa's hands pulsed again, and she could feel its desire to end this threat permanently, to silence the voice that would bring more violence to their peaceful sanctuary. The weapon offered her the knowledge to make the throw, the skill to send the blade spinning across the meadow, to take Ragnar in the back before he could escape. All she had to do was choose to kill. "Let him go," Halvar said quietly, reading the conflict in her face. "If you use the heart's power to commit murder, even justified murder, you become what it wants you to become, another conqueror, drunk on the ability to take life." "But he'll bring others," she protested. "He'll never stop trying to claim this power." "Perhaps," the Volva agreed, "but that is a choice for tomorrow's courage to face. Today, you have proven something important, that the heart of winter can choose mercy over vengeance, protection over conquest. That is a lesson worth preserving, even at the cost of leaving an enemy alive." Yrsa lowered the ice sword and watched Ragnar disappear into the canyon passage, carrying his threats and promises of future violence with him. The decision felt wrong in her bones, but she trusted the wisdom of those who understood these ancient powers better than she did. The question now was what came next, and whether she was strong enough to bear the weight of guardianship that had nearly broken even a man like Halvar Grimsson. The ice sword had not disappeared when the immediate danger passed. Instead, it remained solid in Yrsa's grip, its crystalline blade reflecting the late afternoon sun like captured starlight. But with each moment that passed, she could feel its weight growing heavier, not in her hands, but in her heart, as the full responsibility of what she had inherited began to settle upon her shoulders. "The burden is considerable," the Volva said, as if reading her thoughts. "The heart of winter does not merely grant power, it tests the soul of whoever carries it, constantly offering temptations and justifications for its use. Every moment of anger, every instant of fear or desperation, it will whisper suggestions about how easily your problems could be solved with a touch of winter's fury." The young warriors who had been restored to life gathered around them with the uncertain air of men who had experienced death and found it less final than expected. They looked at Yrsa with a mixture of awe and nervousness, clearly unsure how to address someone who wielded such legendary power, yet appeared to be nothing more than a village healer, barely out of girlhood. "What happens to us now?" the oldest of them asked. "We came here following a madman's lies, but we've seen something that most people would never believe. Do we simply return home and pretend none of this occurred?" "You carry word," the Volva replied before Yrsa could speak, "not of the heart's location or the details of its guardianship, but of something more important. You tell the world that there are still those who choose protection over conquest, mercy over vengeance. In times when darkness seems to be spreading, such knowledge can be more powerful than any sword." Halvar had remained silent through these exchanges, standing beside his weapon shed with the expression of a man who had watched his entire world transform in the space of a single afternoon. The axes that had defined his legend still hung on their pegs, untouched despite the violence that had raged in his peaceful valley. His oath had held, but the cost of that preservation felt almost too heavy to bear. "I failed you," he said to Yrsa, his voice thick with self-reproach. "I brought you here seeking safety, and instead I exposed you to dangers that should never have touched your life. You were forced to take up a burden that was mine to carry, simply because I was too weak to... Stop! The word came out sharper than Yrsa had intended, carrying an authority that surprised even her. You did not fail anyone. You kept your oath, preserved your peace, and showed me what it means to choose principle over expedience. If I am strong enough to bear this weight now, it is because you taught me that true strength comes from knowing when not to use power. She turned the ice sword in her hands, studying the way light played through its crystalline structure. Within the blade's depths, she could see swirling patterns that seemed to move independently, like snow carried on wind that existed only in the weapon's heart. The sight was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The vulva is right about the temptations, she continued. I can feel them already, whispers about how simple it would be to ensure Ragnar never threatens anyone again, suggestions that a little strategic intimidation could prevent future conflicts. The power wants to be used, and it's very persuasive about justifying its use. Then you understand why I spent 10 years running from it, Halvar said, why I tried to bury it so deep that it could never again influence anyone's choices. But burial was never the answer, the vulva interjected gently. Power like this cannot be destroyed or permanently hidden. It can only be channeled by someone strong enough to resist its corruption. For a decade, Halvar, you served that purpose. Your guilt and determination to atone kept the heart dormant. But dormancy is not resolution. She gestured toward the valley around them, and Yrsa realized that the landscape itself was changing. Where Ragnar's blood had fallen, the grass was growing taller and greener. Where the restored warriors had lain, wildflowers were blooming out of season. The violence that had stained this peaceful place was being transformed into something generative, something that added to the valley's beauty rather than diminishing it. The heart of winter is not just a weapon, the vulva explained. It is a force of preservation, a power that can freeze decay and maintain what is precious. In the wrong hands, it becomes a tool of stagnation and death. In the right hands, it becomes something far more valuable, the ability to protect what matters most. One of the young warriors pointed toward the valley's entrance, where new sounds were echoing off the canyon walls. Not the heavy footfalls of an army this time, but something lighter and more urgent, horses ridden hard, voices raised in what might have been either pursuit or alarm. Ragnar? Halvar asked, his hand moving instinctively toward weapons he still refused to touch. No, the vulva said, tilting her head to listen more carefully. These are different voices, different purposes. I believe your former companion has encountered unexpected difficulties during his retreat. The first rider to emerge from the canyon passage was a woman Yrsa recognized, Astrid Ironhand, the war leader who had united several northern clans under her banner and earned a reputation for both strategic brilliance and unwavering honor. Behind her came a dozen mounted warriors, but they bore no weapons in their hands and showed no signs of hostile intent. Halvar Grimsson, Astrid called across the meadow, her voice carrying the kind of command presence that came from years of leading others into battle. We have been tracking a criminal who fled in this direction, Ragnar Ironbone, wanted for the murder of an envoy under a peace banner. Have you seen him? He was here, Halvar replied carefully. But he departed some time ago, heading deeper into the mountains. Astrid's gaze swept across the valley, taking in the restored young warriors, the blood-stained grass, and the unmistakable signs that violence had recently occurred in this supposedly peaceful place. Her eyes lingered for a long moment on the ice sword in Yrsa's hands, and her expression shifted to one of recognition and surprise. By the old gods, she breathed. The heart of winter. I thought it was just a legend from the ancient songs. Legends have a way of becoming real when the world has need of them, the vulva said, stepping forward to address the war leader directly. The question is what you intend to do with this knowledge. Astrid dismounted and approached with the careful respect of a warrior who understood when she was in the presence of power that dwarfed her own. But instead of showing fear or greed, her expression held only curiosity and what might have been relief. For 20 years I have been fighting to hold the northern clans together, to prevent the kind of chaos that tears apart everything good and decent in this world. If such power exists, if it can be wielded by someone with the wisdom to use it properly, then perhaps there is hope for a lasting peace. Peace is not something that can be imposed through force, Yrsa said, the words coming from some deep well of understanding that the heart had opened within her. It grows only where people choose to nurture it, where they decide that building is more important than tearing down. Wise words from someone so young, Astrid observed. But wisdom alone will not be enough if word of this spreads. There will be others like Ragnar, others who see ultimate power as something to be seized rather than stewarded. You will need allies, protectors who can stand guard while you learn to bear this burden. The ice sword pulsed in Yrsa's hands, and for a moment she could see possibilities spreading out before her like branches on a tree. Paths that led to conquest and empire, others that led to isolation and gradual corruption, and still others that might lead to something better. "What are you offering?" she asked. "A place in the world," Astrid replied, "not as a weapon to be used when convenient, but as a guardian whose presence reminds us all that some things are more important than immediate victory. The clans need someone who can help them remember what they are fighting to preserve, rather than simply what they are fighting against." The weight of decision pressed down upon Yrsa like the depth of winter itself. She could remain in this hidden valley, safe and isolated, but ultimately useless. She could accept Astrid's offer and enter a larger world where her choices would affect thousands. Or she could try to find some middle path that preserved both her principles and her ability to protect what mattered most. In her hands, the heart of winter waited patiently for her choice, offering no guidance except the cold certainty that whatever she decided would shape not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who looked to her for protection. The answer came from an unexpected source, the sound of steel against stone echoing from the canyon walls, followed by a roar of fury that belonged to no human throat. Ragnar had not fled as deeply into the mountains as they had assumed. Instead, he had been waiting in the narrow passage, and now he emerged with something that made every warrior in the valley step back in alarm. The creature that followed him into the meadow was neither fully wolf nor fully man, but something horrible caught between the two forms. Its body stretched and twisted with unnatural angles, massive beyond any normal beast, with eyes that burned like coals and saliva that steamed in the afternoon air. This was what became of men who tried to claim powers beyond their understanding, not death, but transformation into something that hungered eternally for what it could never possess. "You see what your mercy has wrought," Ragnar snarled, his voice coming from the beast's throat in tones that hurt to hear. "You could have ended this cleanly, could have saved yourselves this horror, but compassion makes fools of the wise. And now you face something that cannot be reasoned with or turned aside." The transformed creature moved with terrible purpose toward Yrsa, its claws leaving gouges in the stone beneath its feet. Behind it, Ragnar's human consciousness flickered like a dying flame, sometimes emerging to speak words of strategy or mockery, sometimes disappearing entirely beneath the beast's primal hunger. "The heart calls to him," the Volva said, her voice tight with concern. "Even in this twisted form, he can sense its presence. He will not stop until he claims it or dies in the attempt." Astrid and her warriors had drawn their swords, but they held them uncertainly, clearly recognizing that normal weapons would be useless against such a creature. The young men, who had been restored to life, backed away with faces pale with terror, their brief taste of death having given them no appetite for facing such an unnatural horror. "Stand together," Yrsa called to them, raising the ice sword as frost began to spread from its blade across the meadow grass. "Whatever this thing is, whatever Ragnar has become, we do not face it alone. But even as she spoke, she could feel the heart of winter responding to the proximity of the transformed creature. The weapon grew heavier and colder in her hands, and whispers filled her mind, not the subtle temptations she had felt before, but urgent demands for action. The power wanted to be unleashed, wanted to freeze the abomination solid and end its threat permanently. "Use me," the whispers urged. "Let winter fill your heart as it fills your hands. Become the storm that scours the earth clean of corruption." For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. She could see exactly how to do it, how to channel the heart's full power through the ice sword, how to call down a cold so complete that it would flash freeze everything within 100 yards. The creature would die instantly, along with Ragnar's corrupted consciousness, and the threat would be ended forever. But Halvar's words echoed in her memory. "If you use the heart's power to commit murder, even justified murder, you become what it wants you to become." "There has to be another way," she said, speaking as much to herself as to the others. "Some path that doesn't require me to become a killer." The beast thing that had been Ragnar was circling now, testing the reach of the ice sword's influence while looking for an opening to strike. Its movements showed an intelligence that went beyond animal cunning. This was still a thinking creature, still capable of strategy and planning, which made it infinitely more dangerous than any mere monster. "You speak of paths," it rumbled in Ragnar's distorted voice. "But there is only one truth in this world. The strong take what they want, and the weak make excuses for why they cannot stop them. I have become strong beyond your comprehension. What will you become?" As if responding to the creature's challenge, the ice sword began to change again. The crystalline blade elongated and broadened, becoming something more like a spear than a sword, and its point blazed with cold fire that made the air around it shimmer. Yrsa felt knowledge flowing into her mind, not just of how to fight, but of the deeper purposes that weapons could serve. "A blade can kill," she said, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over mountains. "But it can also protect, can also preserve what matters most. The heart does not demand blood, it demands choice." The transformed creature tensed its muscles for a charge that would bring all its unnatural strength and hunger to bear against her inexperienced guard. Around them, warriors raised useless weapons, and healers prepared to tend wounds that might prove beyond any mortal skill to mend. But Yrsa was no longer thinking of victory or defeat, of survival or sacrifice. She was thinking of what the Volva had said about the heart's true nature, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a force of preservation, a power that could maintain what was precious in the face of entropy and decay. The charge came with the force of an avalanche, the beast creature's massive form covering the distance between them in 3 bounding leaps that shook the earth beneath everyone's feet. Its claws extended like sword blades, its jaws opened wide enough to encompass Yrsa's entire torso, and its eyes burned with a hunger that had consumed everything human about the man who had once been Ragnar Ironbone. But instead of meeting that charge with the ice spear's point, instead of driving crystalline death through the creature's heart, Yrsa did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She planted the spear's butt in the soft earth and held it crosswise, not as a weapon, but as a barrier. "I know you're still in there," she called to the monster, bearing down upon her. "Somewhere beneath all that rage and hunger, Ragnar Ironbone still exists, and I know what you really want. Not just power, but the peace that comes from no longer having to fight for everything you possess." The creature's momentum carried it against the ice spear with tremendous force, but instead of piercing flesh, the weapon held firm as an immovable barrier. Where creature and crystalline ice touched, something extraordinary began to happen. The beast's corrupted form started to slow, not with death or injury, but with a creeping lethargy that seemed to spread from the point of contact. "Sleep," Yrsa whispered, and her voice carried across the meadow with the authority of winter itself. "Rest. Let the anger drain away like water from a broken vessel. Remember what it felt like to be human." The Volva gasped in amazement. She's not trying to destroy the corruption, she's trying to heal it, to freeze the transformation in place and give Ragnar's humanity a chance to reassert itself. But the effort was enormous. Yrsa could feel the heart of winter drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, pulling energy from her very life force to fuel this act of preservation rather than destruction. Her vision blurred with exhaustion, and she felt her knees beginning to buckle under the strain. "Let us help," Halvar said, stepping forward despite his oath against violence. "This is not killing, this is healing on a scale that requires more than one person to accomplish." One by one, the others joined them. Astrid placed her strong hands over Yrsa's on the ice spear's shaft. The young warriors added their strength despite their fear. Even the Volva contributed, speaking words in the old tongue that seemed to guide and focus the heart's power. Together, they held the barrier as the creature's struggles grew weaker and its form began to shift back towards something more recognizably human. The process was neither quick nor easy. Corruption that had taken root so deeply did not yield without a fight. But gradually, inexorably, the beast's features softened, its claws retracted, and its burning eyes cooled to something that held reason rather than pure hunger. When Ragnar Ironbone finally collapsed to his knees before them, he was human again, though changed by his experience in ways that would mark him forever. His hair had gone completely white, his hands shook with palsy, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stared into his own soul and found it wanting. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why save someone who tried to destroy everything you care about?" Yrsa released her grip on the ice spear and sank to the grass beside him, exhausted beyond words but strangely at peace. "Because that is what the heart of winter truly does. It preserves what is precious, even when it is buried beneath corruption and violence. And every human soul, no matter how far it has fallen, retains something worth preserving." The ice spear dissolved as she released it, melting back into the simple wooden training sword that Halvar had carved years ago. But the knowledge remained, the understanding that power used for preservation rather than destruction could accomplish things that no amount of violence ever could. "This changes everything," Astrid said quietly. "If the heart can heal such corruption, if it can restore rather than simply destroy, then we have hope for problems we thought were beyond solution." Ragnar struggled to his feet with the unsteady movements of a man much older than his years. "I remember what I was," he said, "what I did, what I became. The guilt of it will never leave me, but perhaps I can find some way to atone." "Atonement begins with choice," the Volva observed. "Every day, every moment, choosing to build rather than tear down, to protect rather than exploit. It is not easy work, but it is work that matters." As the sun began to set over the hidden valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Yrsa understood that something fundamental had changed in the world. The heart of winter had revealed its true nature, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a force of restoration, and that knowledge would ripple outward from this place like stones dropped in still water. The question now was how to use that knowledge wisely, and whether humanity was ready for the kind of power that preserved rather than destroyed. 3 seasons had passed since the battle in Halvar's Valley, and the world beyond the hidden canyon had begun to change in ways both subtle and profound. Word had spread, as word always does, but not in the manner that any of them had expected. Instead of drawing treasure seekers and would-be conquerors, the story of what had happened attracted a different sort of visitor entirely. They came seeking healing rather than power warriors broken by years of violence, villages torn apart by feuds that had lasted generations, leaders who had forgotten how to make peace instead of war. They came because they had heard whispers of a place where corruption could be cleansed, where the cycle of vengeance could be broken, where someone had learned to use the greatest power in the world for restoration rather than conquest. Yrsa stood at the edge of the valley's natural amphitheater, watching as Halvar worked with a group of former raiders who had come seeking redemption for crimes that had haunted their dreams. His gentle hands guided them through the cultivation of his expanded gardens, teaching them that the same strength that could wield an axe could also tend growing things. The wooden training sword lay across his shoulders now, no longer a symbol of abandoned violence, but a reminder that true strength came from knowing when not to fight. The heart's influence spreads farther each day, the Völva observed, appearing beside her with the silent step of one who had learned to move between worlds, not through conquest or compulsion, but through example. People see what happened here and begin to believe that change is possible, that the patterns that have trapped them for generations can be broken. The old seer had remained in the valley, claiming that her work of weaving fate was finally complete. But Yrsa suspected the real reason was simpler. After centuries of manipulating events from the shadows, the Völva had found something worth protecting in this place where broken souls came to learn how to heal. In the months following the confrontation with Ragnar, the former bandit leader had proven true to his promise of atonement. His transformation had left him physically weakened but mentally clear, and he had thrown himself into the work of undoing the damage his old life had caused. He travelled between the settlements that had suffered from his raids, offering what recompense he could, and serving as living proof that even the most corrupted soul could find its way back to humanity. "He asked me to give you this," Astrid said, approaching through the wildflowers that now carpeted the valley floor. The war leader had become a frequent visitor, bringing news from the outside world and taking back with her the knowledge of new ways to resolve conflicts that had once seemed intractable. The leather pouch she handed to Yrsa contained a collection of small wooden tokens, each one carved with the symbol of a different settlement. They represented communities that had chosen to lay down arms and seek peaceful solutions to their problems, inspired by the story of what had happened in this hidden valley. 23 villages so far, Astrid explained, all of them requesting mediation rather than resorting to violence when disputes arise. The old ways of solving problems through strength alone are beginning to seem outdated, primitive even. Yrsa turned one of the tokens over in her fingers, marveling at the delicate craftsmanship. Each one was unique, but all bore the same message that people were ready to try something different, ready to believe that problems could be solved without someone having to lose everything. The young warriors who witnessed the transformation have become the most effective messengers, she said, thinking of the farm boys who had come seeking glory and left with something far more valuable. They speak with the authority of those who have seen the alternatives to violence firsthand. From across the valley came the sound of laughter, not the harsh amusement of those who took pleasure in others' pain, but the genuine joy of people learning to live without fear. A group of children from nearby settlements were playing with some of the restored warriors, their games involving healing herbs and growing things rather than swords and shields. "Sometimes I wonder if we have simply traded one form of power for another," Yrsa mused. "Instead of imposing our will through force, we are changing the world through influence and example. Is that not still a form of conquest?" "The difference lies in choice," the Völva replied. "Those who come here seeking change do so freely, and they are free to leave if they find our ways unsuited to their nature. We offer possibilities, not ultimatums." As the evening approached and the valley's residents gathered for their communal meal, Yrsa found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this place. She had fled burning Bjornstead as a voiceless maiden with nothing but her life, and now she stood as guardian of a power that could reshape the world. But the transformation that mattered most was not in her circumstances, but in her understanding of what strength really meant. The wooden training sword that had once symbolized Halvar's rejection of violence had become something new, a token passed between those who chose to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. It no longer belonged to any single person, but moved freely among those who needed reminding that true power lay in preservation rather than conquest. "Do you think it will last?" she asked, watching families that had once been enemies sharing bread around the same fire. This peace we are building, can it survive when we are no longer here to tend it? Peace is like any living thing, Halvar answered, joining them as darkness began to settle over the valley. It requires constant care and attention to thrive. But if we have taught people to tend it properly, if we have shown them that it is worth preserving, then perhaps it will take root deeply enough to survive whatever storms may come. In the distance, wolves howled to the rising moon, not in hunger or aggression, but in simple acknowledgement of the night's beauty. Even the wild creatures seemed to sense that something had changed in this place, that violence was no longer the first answer to every challenge. Sometimes the broken are exactly who we need to save us. Sometimes the gentlest souls hide inside the strongest bodies. And sometimes, when the world seems darkest, ordinary people discover that they carry within themselves the power to light the way forward for everyone who comes after. The heart of winter had found its true guardian at last, and winter itself had learned the difference between the cold that kills and the cold that preserves what matters most.